So, hello, everybody. I'm here with Yosef, and Yosef's someone that I've been aware of in the corner for probably about 2 or 3 years. I think you've slowly come out of the lurk more and more with time. And I've seen you in relation first with Jacob and Hezi, but then coming out more on your own. And I know you're often posting in Discord, but quite frankly, I don't follow the Discord text channels at all, really, really just the voice chat. And I know you were also at Southeastuary, but unfortunately, I had other things and also just coming off of Midwestuary, so couldn't make that. So much to my disappointment. But I have a feeling we'll probably end up meeting as corner things continue forward. So yeah.
Hopefully.
So when Yosef and I were originally discussing, yeah. Oh, you do want to introduce yourself, Yosef? Go ahead.
Oh, it's okay. I'm Yosef. I've been in the corner for I don't know, about 5 years or so. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I'm happy. I'm happy to have this conversation. It's kind of long overdue. Um, I, I've heard we've never actually. I don't know. We've not really directly interacted very much. So this will be exciting. I'm excited for
I don't think so. Yeah, like ships in the night. So yeah, but when we were initially discussing what this could be about, um, yeah, probably the area that intersects into the corner the most that I really care about or was formed by or influenced me immensely. But the problem, sorry, I'm meandering here. Problem is, most people within the corner have not been influenced by this, don't think in these terms. So it's been difficult to find conversational partners to relate to in these terms are in Jungian terms, in terms of archetypes, in terms of the collective unconscious, in terms of spirit, as Carl Jung would understand that. Um, and I think the main thing that I was really curious about your perspective on, and for a few different reasons, but I I I can't really find people to talk about the cultural zeitgeist as such in terms of collective spirit of the age or cyclical changes or what Jung would call it, at an individual level, he'd call it possession or uh, something that's got a hold of someone, and to a certain extent, to a certain extent, there are always things that have their hold on a culture, so to speak. And what I was really curious was your perspective on where we are in the cultural trends as they stand, because to me we do seem to be at a crossroads. And yeah, it's not entirely clear to me that this whatever change we're going through is a bad one, because I think it might be a essential one that we go through. But I'm always really scared about is I feel like we have these waves that come both economically and culturally. And we have these waves. And the problem happens when we have like a cultural wave that's resentment focused or just grievance focused. And we have an economic wave at the same time that's usually when really bad things happen. That combination of like economic grievance and then cultural grievance. And so far, we haven't seemed to hit that since the great, well, even in the Great Depression, the US was much better off than Europe, which is, yeah, why I think the US did not have a revolution, transformation, in the 30s. But anyway, that's the broad theme that I would like to start with, and then we can get more specific.
Yeah. So I should like first qualify. I'm not a like expert in Jung, um, and a lot of my exposure to him, probably almost all, outside of like little bits here in the corner, let's say. And I'm not a like I didn't follow Peterson, like so I didn't really get any of Jung through him. Was is through Jewish teachers incorporated in him. There's a lot of parallelism between parts of Jung, not all of it for sure, but specific parts of Jung, just around archetypes, around shadow and integration, um, and to some degree, some of the I'd say historical process stuff that um, is very close to models, especially out of Hasidism, which are they're drawing from a metaphysical Kabbalah, but it's a very specific psychological or psychologized version of Kabbalah. Um, and in fact, when Jung um, discovered some Hasidic texts in he was around 80, I think, um, he or late 70s. He actually like he immediately recognized that they were talking about the same thing he was, but like 100 years before. And they had just kind of appeared in translation when he was discovering them, so they wouldn't have been available outside of Hebrew before that, or I guess get some Yiddish. Um, and there was this kind of interesting convergence when he kind of came across these, and he recognized it. And in fact, his primary student was a religious Jew who then eventually moved to Israel. So there's a lot of Jungian psychologists in Israel, and not just psychologists, but people who have brought Jungian ideas into kind of conversation with Judaism, and um, a lot of teachers who have passed through Israel, whether they say they're or not, end up kind of being exposed to Jungian ideas, and then and especially the synthesis of Judaism with Jung, and kind of come back. So okay, so that's like the background.
Is that Eric Neumann? Because, or I forget his first name, something Neumann, but Hezi asked Jung's student, because Hezi asked if I could read a certain treatise from Neumann, but I looked online, I couldn't find it for less than $150, and I was like,
Yeah,
I'm not buying this thing for 150 bucks.
I'd have to double check the name.
Yeah,
I just
he
remember
wrote, I could pull it off my shelf, but he wrote the collect something about the yeah, this guy.
that is very likely. I'm trying to look it up, but it's fine. It might be
The
him.
Origins and History of Consciousness. Yeah,
Yeah,
this is how I started from
there you go.
Peterson's recommendation, this is how I started getting into
Yeah.
Jung, but this yeah.
So so it is this weird convergence, because there's all these, not just rabbis, but whatever, Jewish teachers, men and women, mostly in the Orthodox world, though some has seeped into kind of more secular or less religious kind of like Jewish culture thought, that really discusses it. I have books on like Jacob and Esav from kind of a Jungian perspective. I have like from like 6 years ago, 7 years ago, like people were doing this work like from he was still alive, I think, right? Like he wasn't even right, wasn't he still alive then? So like
I think up
there's
up to the 50s. I think Jung passed away late
okay.
50s.
So maybe it was just after he passed away, or like, but yeah, there was already kind of this move to integrate him. At the same time, I think there was a recognition that his archetypes don't quite match kind of Jewish archetypes that existed, and they may need to be broadened to like be more universal and not just focus on like drawn from Western literature and narratives. That there's a lot more, and there's been a movement. I understand at least. Then again, I've heard that this is not just for us, but other people who picked up Jung outside of the West have worked on expanding his archetypes to other worlds of literature and narrative, because a lot of what he was drawing on was a very narrow view, um, especially like it was overly for all like amount of work that Joseph Campbell did with the Hero of a Thousand Faces and all that. Like it was overly reductive, and they tried to kind of create a universal pattern story, but there's just a lot more to say that it couldn't just be reduced. Anyway, so but we generally like if there are people who talk about like Abraham being an archetype and Isaac being an archetype, and that is kind of how Kabbalah even pre-Hasidism, even pre-psychology, kind of already was understanding them. And it has like there's like four primary male archetypes, which are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and David. To some degree, there's also like archetypes within um, most of the tribes. So like Ephraim and Manasseh, Levi, Simon, Reuven, Judah, Joseph. The other ones maybe not quite. No, Dan. Dan's the other one.
Wouldn't Joseph also be an archetype? I don't
Yeah,
know.
so
which
So
of
he's
those
like
4? Yeah.
so yeah, as I said, like the tribes are also archetypes. Maybe there aren't as well developed ones for every single one of the, let's say, 13 tribes, but there are for Joseph and Judah. There's pretty extensive development on those two archetypes, and they're both archetypes of Messiah. Like they're two different or leadership. They're two different models of leadership, and there's like a lot of work on that. But yeah. Anyway, that wasn't your question though. That was just like background and why I'm not a young expert, uh, or
No,
why my understanding, or
it's
why my
neat.
understanding of
It's
him is
good
going to be,
background though. Yeah.
yeah, my understanding of him is going to be very different. The other really big difference is going to be on, well, there's going to be a couple of other big differences. One is on gender, um, and we're probably going to get into that because we like Judaism inherits the metaphysic of gender from Kabbalah, which is which just has a very the masculine and feminine roles are very different than I think Jungian, much more Western influenced understanding of those roles. And we can get into that. As far as kind of history, um, so I think like we've definitely gone through periods. Like nothing as big, obviously, as Europe in the 30s. Um, we have, I think though, like even during like the 70s, the recession in Carter and the gas crisis, and like there was definitely like that moment of like, where there was kind of a big reorientation, um, in many ways setting up the current, the current world.
Post
Um,
civil rights, that was the other big thing in the air.
the post
Yeah.
civil rights, where there was like there was an economic crisis at the same time as like a real kind of social crisis and realignment and questioning of institutions and like a lot of kind of similar things that we just seem to be resonating with now. Um, and even in the 30s, like it was like the country could have gone much. Like we could talk about like what happened, but like it could have gone much more radical. Like there were some really serious, massive campaigns of that were much more evolutionary, both kind of uh, like fascist and like or isolationist, right? We had both, and we also had communists and anarchists, right? Like everyone was kind of agitating, um, and there was a very like part of the reason we can debate whether it was good or not, but the expansion of executive power in the 30s, and like was kind of the only way that we avoided something probably much bigger. Um, and there's obviously fights over it. There's whether FDR did a good thing or not, and all the social programs, but he was trying to hold everything together and appease as many people as possible in a way that kind of prevented it might have really prevented like a much more radical shift, or overturning.
I r we have, the World War II museum here in New Orleans, and, I could be getting this wrong, but I'm pretty sure, it's accurate that right before the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, American sentiment, it was pretty evenly split on both sides. It
Hmm.
wasn't overwhelmingly in favor of the Allies, and it really took a
Yeah,
direct attack to change the spirit of America, so to speak.
yeah. Um, I mean, there was a pretty big element of a pro-Nazi party here, and for the most part, like there were questions on whether they actually should enter the war and like as a economic ally, um, of the Nazis within that group, or whether they would rather just stay out of it, but they kind of just tacitly support them. Um, and yeah, it was a lot bigger than like most people remember, because especially like once the war started and it was very clear which side we were on, people did not want to be reminded that they had supported, the other direction, or they didn't want other people to remember they supported the other direction. Forget that they supported it. They didn't want like to be associated with Nazis, and that was like a very so. So the spirit of this age, jumping 100 years ahead here. Well, why don't you? So there was something that struck me. I know you've brought it up a couple times. Why don't you paint a little bit of your picture about your wilderness idea? I think that might be a good starting point to kind of begin
Sure.
to, to picture something.
Let me go back to my notes here and make sense that make
Yeah.
sure I have um, I don't know how to get there to what the wilderness is. If you okay, maybe I can get there this way. Um, I think during the formation conversation, yeah, I used the analogy of King Saul and David. And I think someone else was talking about Moses and Pharaoh. And the question is for me, it's this question of thresholds. And is there a point where something is better left than attempted to be fought for? That threshold seems to be very high biblically. Like it seems to be much higher than most people want to tolerate. And so what I mean by that is like uh I think it was Abraham negotiating with God, right, about Sodom and Gomorrah, or if there are 50 good people, 40 good people, 30 good people, like all the way down to. And I remember Peterson talking about that in the Genesis lectures. Like, it doesn't take that many good people to actually hold something together, to keep something going. And I remember thinking about that and being like, that's a mission right there to like just hold things together. Um, but I see so much of our culture today is focused on how can one take advantage of existing institutions or structures versus like it's using the cultural mechanism for some end that's typically selfish or self-serving rather than in and of itself. Um, like the university system, using the university system to promote an agenda for students to think and act in a given way, as opposed to pursuit of knowledge, wisdom, truth in and of itself. Um, and to some extent, that's sort of the natural capitalistic way. Is like we are going to, at the end of the day, we have to be profitable. We have to pay the shareholders. We have to, but we want to do good in doing it. Like Google's what is it? Don't do evil. Is that Google's tagline? Or don't be
Mm.
evil?
Used to
Or
be. They stopped. They got rid
oh,
of it. But
they
yeah,
changed. They got rid of. They don't have to worry about evil anymore. Yeah.
nope,
Uh,
gone. They figured it out.
um, and so getting to the wilderness, the question is like this question of thresholds. Like, what is the point that a certain uh and I'll take it for a given institution. A given institution is no longer uh solvent, but that's not the right term I'm looking for. Is no longer sustainable. So an example might be like Blockbuster. There was a
Hmm.
point at which Blockbuster Video was no longer a sustainable institution, where Blockbuster was like a cornerstone of family life for 2 decades. Um, I read this article recently that because of demographic changes and also just the cost benefit analysis of your typical high school student, m we are in the very early phases of college closings. We just hundreds of colleges across the United States are closing, but that's tip of the iceberg. That over the next 20 years, I actually anticipate over the next 20 years, we'll probably have 80% of colleges across the United States close. That's what I think. Um, and it's not gonna be for any obvious reason other than I mean, in some ways, it's because people have lost faith in the ability of these institutions to deliver a promise or deliver value. And that loss of faith is a couple of things. You have You have great inflation. So you have like Peterson talked about that. I liked how Peterson talked about this. Was that at the very least, if you could graduate college, it indicated that you had a certain level of intelligence and you had a certain level of conscientiousness. Like you could pass a certain bar. And so as that bar gets lowered for a given institution, but there's also kind of a race to lower that bar across institutions in order to have more graduates at a higher level. We graduate 90% of our student body. They only graduate 60% or, but that also kind of deflates the value of that particular institution. And it's the lowering of standards in terms of admission standards, but also standards in the individual. So there's a lowering of standards at each individual at each level, both into the institution, but within the institution. But then simultaneously, they're so costs rise, that hurts economically, but simultaneously, there are other mechanisms for assessing those traits because an employer is really trying to look for conscientiousness, industriousness primarily, and intelligence, and then also I would also think that in today's day and age, an employer is really looking for kind of a value alignment. Um, so it's how much is this person's values aligned with the mission of our maybe that's not yet a thing, but I don't know. Um, Meaning what's the person like when the shit hits the fan, so to speak, like, is the person, able to step up and go the extra mile and, all these things. And, anyway, like, I know a number of companies that are bypassing the college system entirely. I think Elon Musk has been an advocate for this, but, like, I think more and more are gonna do this where if they can find a really good candidate in high school, that is in effect, you're prioritizing earlier access to human capital, human resource. Um, and then the last factor for the colleges is that, all this knowledge is democratized. It's all out there. So really your ability to demonstrate a proficient level of knowledge of speaking, of writing, of problem solving, critical thinking, whatever it might be, that yeah, that can be demonstrated through other means, and you can learn the technical abilities if you're an autodidact with those traits. Yeah, anyway, that's a lot, but that's just colleges in a nutshell, because the whole purpose so at the same time that the colleges have undermined their own purpose of pursuing, let's say, truth and understanding of the world as such, that's been a secondary desire as opposed to promoting sociological goals, you could say. At the very same time, the college as the bastion of knowledge has diminished. That it's because it's more ubiquitous, let's say.
Okay, there was a lot there.
Yeah, and that's just colleges, but, like, the same applies to
Yeah, no,
yeah,
I
yeah,
I
mhm,
hear you. It's a lot like the conversation. Um, Gosh, I don't remember who originally had it. It might have been on Luke's stream. Kale brought up this idea of jigs and like um, that we have these jigs and they wear out. But like the whole point of the jig is you make the same thing over and over again, and it does it reliably because you like figured out how to do it, and you don't want to keep like measuring. Sartori had a very nice little follow up actually on like he showed a real jig and like for putting holes in cabinets, and then was like talking about it, both at both levels, kind of at what goes wrong in real jigs, like as a practical like solution, and then kind of also at the um, church as jig level. Um, and it's a lot. It's a lot what you're talking about, right? So um, before I totally launch into this, one of the things that I picked up on, his name's Paul Allen, the guy that had this universal basic institution idea that
yeah,
PBK has been playing with. So, um, so one of the things that bothered me immediately, not bother me, but like that I immediately noticed was like, why are we talking about institutions beyond the fact that it's so cute because it spells UBI still? Like why is it institutions and not culture or values or language or like why is it specifically that? Now they're listening to them, I realized that they mean institutions in a very broad sense. So it covers a lot more than probably in my head what I originally thought. At the same time, one of the things that he kind of defined in the institutions was they are autopoietic, right? So they are um, sort of self-sustaining and writing themselves into existence. And that is like a necessary thing for any kind of, I don't know, whatever, if you want to talk about it, he's using a lot of bio analogies. So an organism, like if you're going to be self-sustaining, like, yeah, you have to keep like replacing your cells and growing and doing like all these things to kind of maintain equilibria and like adapt to your environment and like all those types of things. Um, and at some level, like you have to like to do that consistently, you do need to find a way, like a repeatable system that allows some sort of self-sustaining structure. The problem is that any self-sustaining structure that emerges, and they do emerge kind of naturally, I mean, this is kind of the whole Vervaekian kind of immersion, whether on the physics level, the chemistry level, the biology level, like stable structures emerge in nature and in life, and then they have the tendency to want to focus on their own self-sustainment for whatever like their original goals might have been, right? You have an adaptation, you know, you had a mutation and it's stuck around because it seems to be helping you digest, I don't know, lactase or something. Um, and then like it's just gonna stay there and like things will build up like other they'll associate with like other sorts of immune genes, so like they're going to start moving as a package and that will help them all like last longer, and there'll be things in the DNA that then protects that section more, so the parts of our DNA that have, for our immune system are better protected than other parts because like our bodies know those are really important to protect for us to like stay alive. But like this lactate thing, this lactase one, that slips in because like it just gets associated with those genes, and it survived early on that way, and it's kind of just okay. So it helps lots of people digest milk, but like it's not as critical as like things protecting us from much more dangerous diseases or cancers or whatever. But it's there, and we just kind of have this as an extra thing. Um, so
Or an appendix, for instance.
Or an appendix, right? Like, so right, exactly. Vestigial organs are a great example of like we don't seem to need them anymore, um, but they had a purpose. They might still have a small purpose. The appendix maybe doesn't so much, but other ones do, right? Tonsils, right? They still have a purpose, though we can live without them. Um, and yet, um, the question is like, are they actively like harming the system or like doing something like that's going to bring it down, right? And there's like there's two parts to that, right? There's one is originally I adapted this for this purpose, or I created it around this telos or this goal, right? Um, it's going to then accumulate all these other things around it to make it more of a package, not just like a single thing. Which is why like when we talk about like what makes a good marriage or whatever, like it's really hard to say like one thing because like these are not individual things. They have a lot of different things that have been brought together in a package. And then they also have this like self-sustaining component, which is like it's another goal that develops automatically in these systems kind of naturally. And if that becomes the primary goal, right, then you basically get ossification. Like if my institution no longer really cares about all those other goals and everything else. This was to your university point. I care much more that universities survive as an economic, or not even economic, just as an institution. They're too important to collapse. We can't, you know, we're going to bail them out. Whatever it is, we're going to save
Well,
this
that was the
institution
financial crisis. Yeah.
out of the financial crisis.
Too big to
It's
fail.
institutions. It's people's housing to some degree, right? Like they had to like deal with the mortgage crisis too, right? Like, and there are some things that we we become very vested in their existence, and we have to be to some degree. Like, I mean, only in the sense of the amount of change that would happen if they do fail would be like catastrophic in some sense, in a real way. I mean, it could just be like in the domicide way, right? Like losing our sense of place, home, meaning, like that Vervaeke talks about. It could be like actually domicide, like we lose our house over our head. And like that is not something a lot of people want to risk, obviously. Um, so there's a lot of vested interest in these things continuing, but at some point, like it really just takes a weight on it of its own. Now it's interesting you pointed out that the Bible has a very high threshold for this, because I think that there are two different thresholds. One, and I think we'll start with the David example or the Moses one. They're good. when you're already in a society and you're already committed to it and you're already part of it, um, it was only when the arena turned against and actually became weaponized. It became an agent, right? When the arena became an agent and sought the death of David and or Moses, um, that they take themselves out of it, right? They have to leave that situation. Like it is no longer safe for them. Like it is not. It's not practical for them to stay there, and they leave. Um, Now they have different paths to some degree. I mean, Moses wasn't when he leaves is not planning to come back. He's not planning to rescue anybody. Like he's just leaving and said going to set up life somewhere else. God pushes him back. David, like going into it, already knows that there's this kind of prophecy slash like one of his multiple anointings. I think he has three, but like one of them has already happened. He knows that like he is supposed to be king someday. um, he probably has like he probably can't see the path forward. Like even with that, he's like, okay, I guess I'm gonna go run away now and literally give up the house over my head, right? And he goes to yeah, and his wife, and he goes to live in a cave. Um, and yeah, I mean, he really roughs it out. And I imagine it was a lot of despair, right? Like he's leaving his best friend. He's like that. That's a great scene with Jonathan. He leaves his wife. He like and King, who he thought he was helping, who he thought he was supporting. He was part of the palace like structure and institution. He had risked his life defending it, right? Like when he fought Goliath, like he had a real investment in this set of institutions. Um, and once it turns against him, once the arena turns, he like leaves. Um, there's a different model though too, which is the Abraham model, because when Abraham and Lot get back to the land of Israel or Canaan, I should call it Canaan, it's not Israel, the land of Canaan at that point, from Egypt, and they come back and their shepherds are fighting. There's not enough pasturage, um, and they're not part of a society yet. They're not living within a specific place, and there's like a much more big flexibility of choice, right? And Abraham tells Lot like, okay, you pick first. I don't want you to like feel resentment toward me that I picked the best thing first. Like, um, you know, even though you're my essentially is like almost like an adopted son. Um, he would have been the heir. I mean, that's the irony. Like if he had stayed around, like he could have been the heir. He was the only candidate at the time. Um, but he, he kind of he was feeling his own strength. He had gotten rich on in Egypt too, on his own a little bit, or maybe because of Abraham, but he's kind of doing his own thing. He started his own business, whatever model we want to say here. And he goes and he's like, oh, well, Sodom looks awesome. It actually reminds me a lot of Egypt, where I just got rich. And yeah, like they did kidnap Sarah. Like he doesn't say this, but like, at the back of our head, we know that like Egypt, which is yes wealthy and successful and like all the things that allowed him to kind of thrive, also was the place that did kidnap Sarah. And like that does inspire fear in outsiders of abuse. um, and lo and behold, Sodom is like that. It's actually even worse perhaps, but like it's a model. It is like Egypt both in its wealth and all and its and in its attitudes toward strangers and toward kind of sexual sin. And like he doesn't see that though, right? Like he doesn't see that. He's like, or even if he does see it, he's like, I can survive there. Like it's okay. Like I maybe, and in some ways, maybe he thought he could because he was Abraham like. If you compare the scene where he greets the angels and when they visit him in Sodom, it's very, very similar to what Abraham does. Like it's in fact, it seems like they're deliberately being compared positively to each other. Um, and in fact, he does more than Abraham because he risks his life and his family's life for them in a way that Abraham doesn't, which is kind of crazy. Um, but like the point of this story, right, is that they did have more choice to join a society or not. Um, and like uh, there, it's not. You don't have to join one that you think is going to be against your values. And Abraham doesn't, right? Abraham deliberately seems to kind of avoid joining um, to any of the city states around him, like even the one that's the most friendly to him, Shalem with Melchizedek. Like he acknowledges him. They have a meal together. They do this like exchange of a tithe or something, bless each other, and and that's it, right? There's no more interaction between them, at least in the text. And I think there is definitely a fear of becoming too integrated into the land, marrying the local Canaanite girls, right? Like those are all kind of issues that come up in the text. Um, and kind of and there the threshold's a lot lower, right? It's not like it has to be they don't be looking to kill you. You can just say like this isn't my value system. I'm going to do my own thing. And I'm going to I can try to influence them. I can even create alliances, right? He has a covenant, right? The first time covenant comes up after Noah, but before like Abraham has a covenant with God, is he makes a covenant with these three Canaanites, with Ner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Um, and was in fact one of the kind of nice teachings that I like is that like one of the reasons Abraham is picked in the first place is because he already believes in the institution of covenant. Um, and so like that allows him to be a good partner for God who wants someone to covenant with. But we know that he's a good covenanter because he's done it with people before, and they really do have each other's backs. And we can see how like with the in the War of the Nine Kings, like how he really comes through with that covenant, and supports them as um, not as not hierarchical. It's not like he's not being like particularly legalistic about it. He's really a good ally. And there's another model there. Now going back to your other question, which um, about universities, I just want to finish this thought and then we can. But you pointed out this kind of interesting thing where like you have this kind of ideal universities are this place that are like learning for its own sake, and then like but really like because of capitalism or whatever they're really instruments of the practicality for like training new people. um I'm kind of skeptical, I guess, of the overly like romanticized views of universities as like ever really being learning for their own sake. If you look at like universities in the 20s, teens, 20s, 30s, and even in the 19th century, like the older universities, right? They they're already secular to some degree. I mean, they're becoming more and more secular into that period. Um, but a lot of it is kind of, I would call it credentialing for aristocrats, right? Like you need an aristocrat had to go somewhere. They didn't even necessarily have to, they weren't necessarily going to work afterward, but like it was a way for them to network, to kind of prove, their mettle. Um, the actual academic level at a lot of the institutions, even like Harvard, Princeton, like those types of places, pre 1920 was not necessarily stellar. Like yeah, they had some of the best teachers in the countries, but the students were not really going there to like most of them were not going there to learn. Um, and there was like a very small group within that were going to become the future professors and theologians, whatever. But a lot of it was more about kind of honor culture, I would say, of the aristocracy and some sort of credentialism. We have in the 20s to some degree. There was a really good article about this last year about the development of this idea that gentlemen scholars was the purpose of what universities should be producing. That was kind of a 1920s idea to some degree, where things are becoming a little more thinking about like progress with a capital P, the good of man, that we shouldn't be like wasting money on these like rich boys who don't actually care, but we should like be investing in people who actually do care about education, and becomes a little more idealistic in that period. But at the same time, while it's on paper it's very idealistic, they're also like trying to create a new technocratic class to run society. So it's still very utilitarian. Um, it's just like it's a very idealistic utilitarianism. Um, so yeah, so I feel like it's a nice idea that universities were meant to be like this. I think they've mostly not really been like this. They're a pragmatic institution that first supported the church and the creation of like its institution, and then kind of moved to the support creation of the aristocracy and then the economy. Maybe are the kind of the three phases that we could kind of look at it from. But um, there is this there's weird contradiction, I guess, in like the way you tell the story, maybe, or like it's a common way to tell the story of what's going on with them. So yeah, the arena of the university is no longer neutral. It's not a neutral arena. It's become much more agentic. Fine, like I think we can all agree on that. Um, at the same time, um, how do I put this? In some ways, I think it became more agentic, the more it became an idealistic. The more like the university saw itself as like really this learning for learning's sake, and the more it kind of could divorce itself from pragmatism, and this speaks to some degree to um, well, to both like the proliferation of like useless degrees, which like people were kind of just pursuing for their own sake, that they didn't think they needed, they just need, they need a bachelor's to get a job or a master's to
Well,
get a job in the real world. It doesn't matter what the actual name on the certificate is, so they're going to learn whatever, right? um like that in itself, I think, is a sign of this, right? Like that there was already like agentic capturing, uh, comes up as part of that idealism. And one of the I'm going to throw something, and then you can respond. It's one of the really interesting things, and one of the big differences between like Jung and Kabbalah is in Kabbalah, um, to take us all the way back to the beginning, like the masculine is that which gives, and the feminine is that which creates the space to receive. So not just receives, but creates the space to receive, which is really important. So obviously, this is coming out of a sexual metaphor, but at the same time, um, like it really fits well with this agent arena idea, because the arenas, what were uh, in Kabbalistic like conception, like feminine constructs, so they are the containers. It's when they became more masculine, when they tried to impose ideas and it become more agentic. Um, and this could just be an entire kind of metaphor for feminism of the mid 20th century. Like as the feminine tries to become to um, to to try to become more masculine and to compete in that marketplace, and so, right, so all those things are sort of happening at practical levels, and we can talk about that, but yeah, so that's kind of the imbalance. So in some ways, if you're talking about spirits of ages, and kind of like probably one of the biggest differences between like a Jungian frame and like kind of this more kabbalistically informed frame, um, is that we're in a period, and have been in a period really, like I'd say since like the beginning of the Enlightenment to some degree, um, of of masculinity that is no longer interested in kind of the discipline of the mother, which I know is like going to be strike some years as odd, but like the mother, like she maintains, right? She is the home and she is the womb, and she like is supposed to maintain the space, and say like no when her kids, want to run all over, and like that's kind of been gone, um, and and in the frame where the masculine is something that just wants to kind of um, expand everywhere, take over the world, um, get its ideas out everywhere, like all these men doing podcasts, right? Like all of us talking constantly, like, and there's no, without like a structure to hold that, it just like, you know, floods everything, and like there's nothing to hold it. Um, a really good analogy for this, by the way, is the parable of the sower. The parable of the sower is the man, and the ground, right, is like are the different types of kind of containers or feminine like ways to hold the seed, and some basically cannot do so. Some do so like too well; they can't say no, so they get like weeds and thorns. I can't remember exactly. I think it's thorns in the sower, right? Um, and it's just like the right balance of being able to both like be fertile ground, but also keep out the weeds that you have to like kind of balance. And that's very different than I think a Jungian, from my understanding of his masculine feminine, where he would like kind of see the modern age as the more in a feminine phase than the masculine.
No, I don't think any of that, um I don't think any of that is at odds with what Jung would teach about the masculine and the feminine. I really don't think so. 'Cause it's hard for me to separate Peterson, Jung, and other Jungian acolytes that I've read over the years. So I don't wanna attribute something to Jung that I'm getting from another source, but it's, that the feminine poses the question. The feminine has to pose the question, and in fact, the question is what creates the space for, the masculine to then take action. And man, there's so many threads that we could go down based on things that you just talked through. But I one of my favorite things that you just mentioned was credential that social college that that colleges were credentialing for aristocrats, and I think that's largely correct. I think multiple things can be true at once. There's a reason I think that in the United States, science and technology flourished, and especially in the Protestant world over the Catholic world, that science and technology really grew at a remarkable pace. Um, because they all had monasteries or centers of learning, but I think there's a and I attribute that to you have slightly more meritocratic norms in Protestant countries and Protestant arena, so to speak. And I think the United States has slightly more meritocratic norms and less of an aristocratic structure because of the nature of the United States not having royalty descended from, multiple generations. And I think because of that, compounded over generations, that colleges were in the United States were uniquely positioned to, take advantage of geniuses that came in and really invented and did wonderful things. I'm not saying that the majority of people that went to college even 100 years ago were that, not even close. Um, but I do think they did have a strong part to play in the dominance of the United States in terms of science and technology in the 20th century. Um, the what was the other thing I was gonna mention there? The credentialing for aristocrats. Yes. So if you can imagine credentialing aristocratic inflation, the dream of going to college is to make it into the aristocratic class because then we're not working class anymore. We got a son or daughter that made good, or the for and then for women to marry into that, in the early part of the 20th century. Um, yeah, and then you can imagine as like it moves from 5% or 10% of the populace to 40%. We need new ways of establishing the aristocracy. So in some ways you could do that just via the Ivy League in certain schools and an alumni network and all of that. But then maybe another way is you establish kind of a sub language or a sub way of talking about, and that's postmodern, all that fun stuff, where it becomes a social signal that oh, you're of us or you're not of us. But somewhere along the way, I don't think, let's say 30, 40 years ago, that the majority of Americans thought that the elites that colleges were churning out were against their interests. I think the majority of Americans still felt that the elites that, let's say, the Harvards and the Yales, et cetera, were churning out were the elites of America, but they largely represented America and were promoting our values and our culture through movies, through media, through, largely, even though they were separated in their elite status, they were largely supported by the American public at large. Like the American public at large would watch Jay Leno or Johnny Carson and they would laugh and then somewhere along the way, and I tie this with I think I don't know why it happened exactly, but I think the severing happened right around a little bit before 2012, and it was right between sort of like Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street was like the last bastion of the left being like pro working class. Like it was the left being about the working class over, you could call it, the financial elites, and then a change happened where it turned from the I don't know exactly how that change happened, but then the left became for the elites that spoke this cultural lexicon that was at odds with what America was prior. And that's the shift that happened in, I think, around 2008 to 2012 that was happening. Yeah, so thoughts on that? But I think the real disconnect, and this is where the wilderness thing comes into play for me, is like, so long as you're always gonna have a hierarchy. You're always gonna have elites in some way, shape, or form. If those elites are accurately representing the interests of the rest of the people, you could say, or the majority of the people. There's always disagreement, um, but once the cultural production, and this is signaled, so the fruits of this would be like the cultural production of those elites, and the fruits were not seen right away because it takes years to develop movies and all that. But then if you think about the movies prior to this transition that were reflected in the Oscars. Like, I remember when, like, Gladiator won the, like, Best Picture Oscar and stuff like that. It's like, yeah, like, this is, like, a distinctly American movie, even though it's a Roman Empire, but you get what I'm saying, right? And, and movies like Titanic that came out that were just, like, a true romance, self-sacrificial, like, the entire world, loved this movie, and multiple generations would go to the theater multiple times to see Titanic. And we stopped producing culture that was uniting, um, and that's really the indicator as I saw it. Like, the culture that was being produced was for the elite class, for this particular type of,
Yeah,
yeah.
so
Go
I
ahead.
think I might flip it almost. Um, I mean, culture generally is produced for the elite class and kind of trickles down for most like historic culture, like institutions around the arts. Like the arts are created, you know, for the elites, and then like Mozart songs eventually get into wherever, or Bach songs they go from the palace to the church, or the cathedral, I guess, depending on what type of country you're in, to kind of the street. And that is normal, but I think I might flip it to some degree where there were multiple like kind of shocks to the system where people kind of um
I can still
s-
hear you. I'm just gonna get a pen because my pen's running out of ink,
okay,
but I can still hear you. One sec.
I think that there are multiple points where people started thinking the elites' interests were not in their own interests. But I think before that, they all saw themselves as having mostly similarly aligned interests. Obviously, there were some major um, points in American history where that was a little bit interrupted. I think before kind of this moment, maybe Vietnam was like what the Vietnam War protests and stuff like that. What had been um, the last one to some degree, the civil rights movements, but because that was eventually kind of endorsed by both parties and both parties like kind of accepted it, I think there was kind of seen as an alignment there, which is different than I think Vietnam. But I think for the most part, it kind of was smoothed out. I'd say I'd probably put much more weight on the financial crisis in 2008, and um, maybe also in the wake of 9/11, and to some degree, kind of the well, there's a whole bunch of things like that the Bush Gore kind of vote in 2000, with like all its issues, hanging chads, and kind of people seeing like the Supreme Court essentially fail institutionally, because it just didn't have, not that it made the right or wrong decision, but like it didn't have the right mechanism. And that, like to some degree, like that was a huge story. The Y2K to some degree also was a little destabilizing. I think a lot of it where like it wasn't just like, hey, this is a mistake or this is like a vestigial like problem with the institutions that needs to be reformed, but like actually there's something like where these institutions are trying to work against our interests like actively and very clearly. Was probably with the financial crisis in 2008, and 2009, and I think I'd probably put more weight on that. And at that point, it's not that it's not that the elite institutions values change. I actually think that for the most part, the elite institutions just tried to keep on going and holding to the values that they had before, maybe doubling down on parts of them. I mean, I'm not going to say they didn't change at all, but like there are parts I think that they held on to a little more tightly than others. For the most part, they kind of just kept chugging in this, going back to our earlier discussion, right? Of just like trying to self-propel and, like sustain themselves. And what they didn't recognize is that suddenly like a whole bunch of people are saying, like, well, hold on, like I'm actually not so sure that we have the same values anymore. I'm going to reassess, right? And I think um, I think that's how, so it's a little bit of a different way of framing than you had, but I think um, there was this, yeah, like a widespread kind of disillusionment with like, not just disillusionment, much stronger than that, where like, hey, like actively this government is doing something um, that it not only like were these other institutions, banks, like against my interests, which I always maybe I already kind of suspected, but like that became very obvious. But the government's clearly going to support them over me, right? The government's clearly going, like they're going to bail them out, and they're for the most part protect them. And people are not going to jail for all the bad things they did to the little guy. Um, and and yeah, technically, like they put in like more regulation, but like I don't really necessarily believe that it's going to do anything. Even that they dragged their feet on for a long time, and now they've gotten rid of all of that regulation. Um, right? So like there was probably good reason not to trust that that was going to do very much in the long term. Um, and yeah, and the kind of the other side, the part that had been carrying the culture and like was kind of like Hollywood, whatever. No, now I guess Netflix was also growing its own power within this period, right? As kind of its I would say almost an alternative to Hollywood and a different way to make decisions. And Disney was also growing massively, right? And Disney was acquiring things left and right. But I think we can talk about that. The entertainment industry is kind of falling into like a much smaller set of players and a much larger, basically monopolies. Is this kind of part of this story too? Um, but one analogy I really like for a lot of this is less kind of, I know Paul Allen does a lot of like the cells biology kind of body stuff. I actually like thinking about this more in terms of evolution, um, where like we have these, like we already sort of touched upon this, but like we're trying to best evolve to changing environments, and our fitness, like whether it's our individual fitness or inclusive fitness, um, just like is always going to be delayed, and we're never gonna like be perfectly fitted to whatever environment we find ourselves in. We're always trying to like play this catch up game, and we can talk about this like biological evolution, but also cultural evolution, right? So like kind of mimetic, stuff,
Oh
and
yeah, I'm
we're just
I'm I'm one of the few people in the corner that believe strongly in evolutionary forces outside of
excellent,
in biology. You're
excellent.
you're talking my language. I
Here
did
we
this
are.
whole
So,
series on Chad's channel on cultural evolution that
oh, see, I
is
missed
now
it. Ugh. Okay.
no, it's okay.
Probably it's not even up anymore
I'll
considering it's
republish at some point. Yeah, I mean,
remade.
I have it, but I could always redo
Excellent.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So I think like there's this goal. And this is one of like the debates I've had with Sam Titteman. Um, is like he has this goal, kind of eschatological messianic vision of like everything is working to this like perfect state. And we're going to like evolve. He has evolution. He definitely like right, but like at all levels, at spiritual, at all the different levels of emergence and down and up this chain, right, of being, and it's all going to like it's going to go to the static state. Um, and I'm not going to talk necessarily about eschatology here. Like I think whether
I
that's true or not,
I
like
yeah,
I disagree with, but like,
yeah.
but whether that vision is true or not, um, I'm much more. I don't know. I can never remember the word that the Eastern Orthodox people use for this. But for us, it's like even in the Messianic age, like things continue to like get closer to God because He's infinite and we're finite, and we remain finite even eschatologically, and we will continue to deepen ourselves in participating in Him even eschatologically. Is my understanding. Um, but because we're not, but even if we leave eschatology aside, like we're in historical time, and I don't think we're evolving to like a perfect form, because the perfect form changes depending on the environment and the constraints and the resources and goals and the context, right? And the history and the current set of genes you have right now, right? Like they're all things that bind and constrain you in different ways. And like we are always playing this catch up game. And like what my fitness is right now and how it's judged is different than it will be tomorrow, because like my environment is going to change tomorrow. And I like what I need to do in this moment. Um, like we don't think about like what you need to be. Like if King David was like totally fixated on like, well, I'm going to be king someday, and like I'm going to like everything's going to work toward that, and I'm going to go to the so like I'm not going to. Why would I move to a cave in Adulam? Like that doesn't make sense. Like politically, like as a like future king, like it makes no sense as a move. Like if he thinks he's really king, legitimately, and I don't think he does. That's one of the points. But like he should probably go with his parents to the king of Moab because he sends his parents there for safety. Why he doesn't go there and like use the Moabite army to like attack Saul and like win? Like he could have done that if he really thought he had a claim to be king, but he doesn't. Like he's the only him and Samuel like know this, and like or maybe I guess a couple of his family members do at this point. But like it's you can't focus on the end and like and then like completely ignore what the situation is in front of you. And that, I mean, otherwise you're basically gonna. Well, actually, there are a lot of people who do that. It's a very specific type of apocalyptic messianic thinking, where you're like, okay, well, tomorrow's going to be the end time, and I'm going to live like every day's tomorrow's the end, and like
Well,
I'm going
I
to
I
stop
was just
like my
thinking
life.
about, our form of entertainment is becoming shorter and shorter latency, and it's like the wilderness time might be a gird your loins time because we have less tolerance for long form because it's not the time for long established building, it's the time for getting ready to move quickly.
Yeah, but here's the thing. It takes Moses 40 years. It takes like at least in our tradition, he's in Midian for 40 years from the time he leaves Egypt to the time he comes back. We know he's 80 when he comes back. So somewhere between 40 and 80 years, according to all opinions, at least 40 years. Um, it takes David 7 years, right? And why does it take them so long, right? Like because it's not just like, hey, I need to like write a really convincing essay on Substack and I'll have, 30 people join me and we'll start like our little community church, whatever. Like and it's not even that they have to build an institution. Kind of what's really interesting about both of them, right, is what they have to do is they have to personally transform. Um, and not only personally transform, but Moses has to personally transform. I would say David has to do more than that. He has to form other people. And not only does he form other people, he has to figure out how to form a bunch of basically brigands, right? Like they're thieves. These are like bad people, right? These are people who have fallen through the cracks of Saul's, institution, and it is failing them. But like these are people who have turned to like pretty sketchy ways of living, um, and he is going to take them, right? He's not taking like some intellectually like I'm gonna take the best and brightest guys from my Discord server and like do this, or even the most pious. Like he's not taking like the 10 uh favorite Protestants from the Protestant channel and BOM and saying like, hey, let's do this thing and like let's start something on our little commune. Like he's kind of stuck with who he's stuck with. Um, and maybe this model doesn't work for the modern age. To your point about like like we live in a world where we can choose what communities we're in, like to a hyper degree more than ever before, and also have like a very short attention span. Like maybe we don't have 7 years or 40 years to like you know
No, no, no. I think we do have 40 years because we need a generation that is capable of marrying and having children in a sustainable way with the current technology cycle. And that takes at least 40 years to get to a sustainable generation that knows how to navigate whatever we're
but
going through technologically
the
currently.
technology will be so different in 10 years and in 20 years and in 30 years that for
See,
us,
that is where I don't think we're gonna hit a singularity. I think we're
I don't
hitting a
think we're going to
new
hit a singularity.
stagnancy. I think we're hitting a new plateau of technology.
Yeah. I know you need to go in a couple of minutes, so
Yeah, me
I
too.
have an idea.
And we didn't
No,
even
no,
get into the masculine feminine, so yeah.
there's so much to talk about. Um,
Next time. Yeah.
next, yeah. Something that struck me when you were talking earlier about this expanding aristocracy, that it's to this point, um, is we sort of seem to be in this weird tension where there's one vision that we are all basically sort of with AI, like becoming, and all the current technology, not just AI, mostly AI. We are basically becoming like the third child of like of a duke. Like we don't have an expectation. We're not inheriting. We're not going to the clergy, probably, right? But we are kind of like we can pursue our own interests and it doesn't really matter, and we'll get a UBI. That's we'll be the duke will pay, make sure that we have food on the table, um and we will be able to kind of just pursue what our creative passions are, and like our silly, like whatever dalliances, and like sleep with whoever because it doesn't really matter, right? Like that type sort of model, right, where it's like a super, like there's a uncommitted to anything kind of world where like AI allows us to just have this like freedom of like this maximally expanded aristocracy. And it's not because of colleges, it's because like the machines will take care of us because like they've surpassed us on all these other matters. There's an inverted vision of that, which just comes from Nietzsche, which is that the only people, and it's almost the same vision, but it's a slightly different version, which is um, only a very, very small group of people who have very, very specific talents, skills, and personalities will actually like matter in the age of AI, because like AI will take care of so much, but there will be a gap. It will not close the singularity gap, and they'll still need a very, very small elite to kind of manage at the top, um, and not just run everything, but also like the greatest musicians, the greatest artists. But everyone else basically can either do whatever, or their existence will be solely for the sake of supporting those Uber mentioned, um, right, for those superhumans, and the AI, right, have to support both. That's important, and that will be their existence. At the same time, because AI can do a lot of things, right? Like, and maybe it's not the best, but let's say it's better than 95% of humans at any given thing, or 90%, or even 80. Like, um, the people who might have gotten really good at certain things aren't going to try there, because like there's the struggle of those in between years, of like trying to become a good artist, trying to become a good guitar player, trying, like, just won't be worth it for a lot of people, um, unless, like, because like one, they won't get any attention or views for it because there'll be like a million deep fakes and like whatever out there, and like so no one will know that they're doing it, so even if they do it, like no one will notice them, so for them to like break out will be really hard, and like it will take the most more discipline than ever to like actually like stick to a talent and try to see it through and like develop a skill set, um and we're like in an age where like these machines basically degrade our ability for that type of discipline.
Well, so
Um,
so what is the hack that we're doing then? What is the hack where, and maybe I'm deluding myself, but I don't think so. So what I mean by deluding myself, that I could be deluding myself, is like I actually care what the 100 or 200 people who watch this, I care more what they think of me than like the rest of society at large thinks of me and my family, and my
mhm,
friends and my so like um so going back to, real quick, the credentialing for
yeah,
aristocrats, the real skill that's gained in college, the real skill is the social, the interpersonal. It's learning to do anything as part of a body, like anything. Could be a volleyball team, could be a fraternity, could be throwing a charity event, it could be a project, could be a genuine like scholastic project. So yeah, I think the in between level between the Nietzschean and Like, I don't see like, a complete aristocracy where everyone's equal and ingesting soma and just having sex from dusk till dawn. I don't see that happening just because sex is, like, drop, 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 like, every indication indicates that we're
But
just
it
getting,
doesn't
like, more and
doesn't
more
have to be that.
isolated
Like,
and
it could
lonely.
be, like,
But
playing
yeah.
video games all day or whatever, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's I do see the temptation being something like play the massive hierarchy game, race for the top, just likes, views, whatever, versus like isolate completely and forget the world, and I'm just gonna do my video games and my AI generated porn until the end of time. But the in between, I think, is somehow we seem to be there, and I know I'm navel gazing again, but, like, I don't know, like, how to make this in between more sustainable for more people, and that's really what I want, because it seems to me to be the sweet spot where, like, at least I find I'm able to cultivate, like, social skills doing this and, like, critical thinking skills, and at the same time so I'm able to, like, somewhat play that hierarchical game of, like, I'm getting better at something, but at the same time, like, care mostly just about being part of a group or a community.
yeah. Um, we so I heard a fascinating point, um, just like yesterday, on that often like what this moment is being compared to is like the printing press or early internet, computers, like these technologies that our brains immediately go to. This person was actually pointing out that in some ways, what this moment is much more like is when the Persian Empire set up its postal system, which like no one thinks about, but they invent the idea.
Satraps? Is that
Yeah, so the satraps are governors of the satrapies, right, of the Persian provinces, but they suddenly, out of nowhere, people who only cared about the 100 people around them, in their community, suddenly the king might know what they're doing, even though he's like super far away, like a continent away. He might know what I'm doing, and there's an awareness suddenly of like what I do like isn't as private anymore. It's not just local. So private is local sense. It's not private like in a but like it's not local anymore. That like what I do actually might have much bigger impact. And at the same time, the people in the empire who found themselves like wasn't yes, the king set up this postal system basically for both mail and spies. By king, I mean the king of kings, emperor. I can't remember if it was Darius or Xerxes, one of them, whichever of them invented the system. But I think it was Xerxes. At the same time, um, people in the empire immediately like realize that there was an opportunity here, and they start like writing, like Jews, for instance. Like this is when we start seeing them writing letters to each other between communities to try to like exert influence and to like say like, hey, we know like you guys don't have, like you're a far flung place that doesn't have like real leadership and like you're struggling. Like this is stuff that we do that helps us, and like maybe it will help you too. And you can see like initially that sounds like really good because like you have all these like people in caves, like going back to the David wilderness analogy of like different groups in caves, and they're not just like isolated. Suddenly they're like writing to each other and trying to like figure out how to survive more in concert. But at the same time, like you introduce a level of like now there are people with political interests in your community that don't live there anymore, and like there are people vying for influence like that aren't immediately part of that 100. And there's like pros and cons to that, right? Like there is this, on the one hand, like I think we are entering some degree wilderness period where like we need to probably concentrate on formation, and we're going to be in the caves of Adullam, like David, and it might take 7 years or 40 years or whatever. At the same time, like I think one of the big questions is like, who are we kind of in the cave with, and like are we going to need like separate Jewish and Christian caves, or like Catholic and Eastern Orthodox and Lutheran and Baptist caves, and like and are we going to like still be in contact and like influencing each other in those caves, like, or are we
um,
gonna like
yeah,
isolate?
I'm way more worried about the feminine masculine divide than I am about Jewish, Gentile, Christian, Muslim. Yeah, but
I I hear you.
I do wanna continue this
Yeah,
conversation, and I do wanna get into the feminine masculine thing 'cause, oh, my most controversial thoughts will come out of that one. It'll be lovely, but maybe next
awesome.
week. But I'm gonna
Okay,
end the recording, but thanks, Yosef.
good. Have a good night.
Yeah. Oh, you can hold on just for a second.